years, Swede and a whole series of horses were to wring proper use from the Mexican saddle, but for now she had to be content with riding it in the Airstream trailer. Yes, we'd brought it along. Poor Swede had begged not to leave it behind, offering Dad any number of maudlin proofs for its value. As her present from Davy, it reminded her to pray for him. It would make an adequate pillow should we wind up sleeping on the prairie. It was Mexican and so long for the West, and so forth. Nothing convincing. So when Dad at last said, well, why not? It was purely because he was crazy for Swede and would pay any price to see her happy. The saddle granted, Swede immediately asked to bring one of the sawhorses from the garage, and thus her design began to emerge. Her final and meekest appeal was for the typewriter. She wanted to document our exploration. She pointed out that Meriwether Lewis had lugged along cratefuls of pens and paper and India ink. Think how tippy that rendered the old canoe. Yet Thomas Jefferson himself had demanded it. I'm sure Dad enjoyed Swede's persuasions, but can you imagine such packing? Would your father have gone along with all this? Nevertheless, when we drove out of August and Bertie's that morning, Swede rode and saddled on a swaying sawhorse in the Airstream kitchen, the typewriter before her on an old fold-down table. She had her coat on, though Dad had lit the heater briefly and goosed the temp to around 60, and she had paper rolled in and was observing the countryside out the louvered windows. And so we take our leave, so we forsake the encouraging company of the last friendly outpost, riding along into a wide, cold land in pursuit of our brother. What a speck we are on this vast prospect! How small appear our chances of success! Plainly, this excerpt represents Swede at her happiest, though it made me feel bleak at the time. That part about the last friendly outpost, well, it wasn't strictly true, as you will learn, but leaving August and Bertie, it sure felt so. Once we'd boarded the trailer, August came coatless around the Plymouth, where he put a bear hug on Dad. A man so thin oughtn't have survived. When Dad sank behind the wheel and off we rolled, a great drop of tin glinting on the snowy plains. Swede and I resulted to the back of the trailer for a last look, saw Bertie on the front step with her hands on her hips. The hound Ricky stood beside her, wiggling his stub tail. The two of them were watching not us, but August, whose face looked strangely slack. His head was tilted, and he was banging on it with one hand, like a man troubled by ear-water. We are headed for the Badlands. August called it a big, busted-up place and believes our Davy has gone there. However, Davy did not say so. It is a long ride west from here, but we have warm weather. There is a soft wind called the Chinook. It is almost 40 outside at this writing, so warm the ditches are dark and the birds are fooled. Some miles ago, a ring-necked pheasant poked his head out from the stubble and watched us go by. Practically every wanted man goes to the Badlands sometime. Butch Cassidy, Mr. Younger, Sam Bass, the Badlands are as good a place as any. Swede was to write dozens of pages before he returned to roofing, which is plenty of typing for someone using only indexes, plus thumbs for the space bar. Reading through them, you will find many an allusion to the two distinguished outlaws of eras past, and not one to the fact of motorized travel. Always it is a long ride west. Always we are proceeding apace through this or that settlement. Davy is surmised to be out front of us by 6 days' trail. Though I'll defend her narrative to the last, Swede's journalistic technique precluded the attendance of one of two facts. For example, not only was Davy not riding a horse any longer, he was driving a Studebaker, its floorboards rotted to mere embroidery. August, for years, had kept the old boat for a field car, using it to inspect fence rows, seek errant beeves, and so on. Seeing Davy's unwillingness to return home with his hands in the air, August decided the Studebaker had been more than faithful to him and needed a change of mission, also of oil. So that freezing sunup found August on his back beneath the chassis, his heart flailing with the loyal and grossly unlawful business at hand. Before Davy finished breakfast, August had affixed old license plates and obscured them with dirt and snow, filled the car up with gas from his scaffolded bulk tank, and placed bread and cheese and a sack of canned goods in the trunk. Taken together, it was a good deal better than going by pony, something even Swede wouldn't have argued with, no matter its literary value. And will we find our Davy safe along this stealthy track? And might all our imploring steal our outlaw brother back? I have noticed that people who love the whole wide parade will just wing off into verse at any chance. Swede did it constantly. Taking nothing from poetry, which we all know is prized as a conduit of wisdom, these lines again suggest an inaccurate picture. What's stealthy about a green Plymouth station wagon yanking along a fat Airstream trailer? The truth is, stealth wasn't an issue. We weren't sneaking up on Davy. We were just trying to get in his vicinity. Anyway, have you ever been to North Dakota? In good sunlight, you can see someone coming 8 miles away. More troubling to me was the question this verse asked about stealing him back somehow. It seemed a reasonable proposition, and wasn't it why we were chasing after him in the first place? Yet it niggled. It put a scene before my eyes in which Davy's return depended on our persuasiveness. I tried to remember a time when I had persuaded my brother to change his mind, not just going along to humor me, which he did often, but coming indeed to believe something different. I didn't have to think long. It had never happened. It seemed unlikely Sweet had done it either. Maybe Dad had, when Davy was a whole lot younger. Determined not to descend this reasoning alone, I said, "Swede, do you think we'll be able to talk him into coming back?" She was quite preoccupied, midstream in something, yet she heard the question and unstirruped her right foot and swung over to face me side saddle. "Do you?" "I don't know." "Seems not very likely, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Swede said. "What would you give to get Davy home?" The way she asked it warned me she'd been thinking about this. "Well, most things, I guess. Anything." "And then what if they stick him in jail?" "Well, I don't know. Knock it off, Swede." Now that I'd started this talk, I wanted out. "You still want him to come home if he has to be in jail?" "How's that for a rotten question?" "Come on, Reuben. You can say yes if it's true." But I couldn't answer. I feared the outcome of honest speech, that it might reach forward in time and arrange events to come. If I told Swede I wanted Davy back, even at the cost of this freedom, might that not happen? And if I said what I sensed was the noble thing, better not to see him at all than pale and dumb during visiting hours, might that not bring despair on this whole crusade of ours? Then Swede, who wasn't volunteering her own answer to the question, asked another. "How come do you suppose August gave Davy that car? Help him get away? Even though they tried to talk him into giving up?" "That was Bertie," I pointed out. "August agreed, though. You know he did." I thought about August riding out in front of me on the George River, he and Britt moving through the fog, a picture of freedom as good as any. August may have wanted Davy to turn himself in, yet nothing seemed more natural to me than his gift of the Studebaker. Could a person believe so strongly one way, yet take the opposite route? I wanted to ask Swede, but again, if I posted aloud, it might become true, and then we were in for all sorts of tangles. "Tell me what you're writing about," I said. Writers can always be distracted this way. I was lucky to learn early in life. "Nightshirts." "What, like August wears?" "Uh-huh." "What do you think of it?" "Well, how come he wears a nightshirt anyway? A man like him." "He has to wear something, Reuben." "Well, but it seems like a lady sort of thing, like a gown," I persisted. "What's the difference between a nightshirt and a nightgown?" "Lace," Swede replied. She leaned forward on the saddle. "Listen, all kinds of men used to wear them. Practically everybody did in Kidnapped. The old awful uncle who sent David Balfour up the ruined stairs and sat waiting for him to fall? He wore one. He was wearing it at the time. Robert Louis Stevenson wore one, and you're so nuts about him." "He didn't either." "Robert Louis?" Yet her declaration rang true. I could almost see the great doomed author, pale as a birch, wafting around his midnight kitchen. "Of course everybody wore them back then," I concurred. "I don't suppose they had long johns yet." I believe there was a general shift from nightshirts to long johns a few years after the Civil War. This was so much like something Mr. DeCuller would have said that I suddenly recalled the aroma of peach pie, which we'd eaten at the lawyer's own table the morning of Davy's trial. Fresh peach pie. My eyes stung for some reason, which made me cross. "Well, how do you know that, anyway?" "I just wrote it," Sweet said, picking up a sheet of typewriter. "Listen. In the weeks before the James gang rode into Northfield, every member was wearing long johns except for Charlie Pitts. Remember Charlie Pitts, Reuben?" "No." "He was the most handsomest of the gang before he got shot." "Oh." I'd seen his picture in a book Sweet got from the library. I suspect it's the only photo ever taken of Charlie, the one where he's braced up dead and on display. They used to prop fellows like that in the store windows for a week or two, something the Chamber of Commerce thought up to bring customers downtown, though it seems impractical in some ways. Swede read, "Pitts was the best dresser of the gang and vain of his appearance, enjoying the comments and company bestowed on him by ladies. He shaved regularly, carrying with him a strop razor and a sheet of tin for a mirror. He owned more stockings than most in his profession, and was fastidious about changing them. He disdained," Reuben, listen, "he disdained long johns, believing them to be a contrivance of the lower classes. along with mittens and pull-on boots. Charlie wore lace-ups. Really? Yes, and a nightshirt to sleep in. His genteel pretensions, and particularly his preference for the nightshirt, attracted rank comment from his compadres, especially from Bob Younger, whose speech was habitually impolite. When hiding in caves or deep in the woods, Bob would wait until Charlie appeared at the fire in his nightshirt, rubbing his gums with salt to keep them healthy, and would proceed to call him Lovely Man or Lillian Pitts or Sweet Charlie O'Ferry. I don't recall this being in Swede's library book, but then she wouldn't have used it if it were. Swede has always stood against plagiarism, believing in original research. At last, days before the ill-destined bank job in Northfield, Charlie Pitts walked nightshirted into a hotel room where Bob Younger sat playing cards. Bob remarked, "Why, if it ain't the Queen of Sheba, come sit on my lap, sweetie, I'll learn you some poker." To which Charlie responded, "Cole," for the eldest Younger was playing too, "if I teach your brother deportment, will you shoot me for it?" "Have at 'em," said Cole, whose cards at the moment were up unpromising. At once Bob stood clawing leather, but Charlie in early days had trained as a boxer and danced in before Robert could fire and dealt a blow to his right ear. The revolver thumped to the floor. Charlie in his nightshirt gripped Bob's hair, set his head back, and deliberately struck the exposed Adam's apple, causing Bob Younger to gag and his eyes to water and his mind to think hard, and what he thought was that perhaps the Queen of Sheba remark had been poorly timed. "Oh, boy," I said. And that's as far as I got. Swede didn't explain how it connected with anything, but I suppose she got a glimpse of August in his nightshirt, and of course outlaws were heavily on her mind. Swede's journalism had a pretty wide throw. We stopped at noon. Dad pulled over in a municipal park in Linton, this being Midfield, North Dakota, and stepped up into the trailer. "Well, amigos, shall we cook beans?" We did, Swede ending up with the coveted knob of fat from the can. Then Dad cranked the heater again, professing intent to nap. Lulled by warmth, I did likewise, going sound asleep to Swede's noisy typing. She woke me minutes later with terrible news. That stinker, Andreessen, was sitting in his car across the park. "No, Swede, it can't be him. Go look again." "It is him. Go look yourself. He saw me watching him. He waved at me, Reuben." That sat me up. "Is he coming over here?" "Wait." Swede ran to a window, peeked edgewise. "Nope, he's just sitting there. His car's running." "Is Dad awake?" She shook no. I slipped to the window. Sure enough, there sat our self-satisfied Fed in a clean beige Mercury across the city park. It was just a narrow little park. There weren't 50 yards between us and Mr. Andreessen. He had a plate of something in his lap, which he kept dipping into, and a cup of coffee in his right hand. "Look at him," Swede said, chewing his French fries. "He wouldn't even eat them in the cafe, afraid we'll pull out and he'll lose us." This appeared to be true, for Andreessen kept looking our way between bites of fry. We had to keep ducking. Swede didn't want to get waved at again. How come he doesn't just come over and talk to us? I gave it some thought. Maybe he just wants us to see him, to make us nervous, the way the Indians are always doing. "We haven't done anything," Swede said defiantly. "All we did was go on vacation. People do it all the time." "Right. We don't know where Davy is at all. How would we know?" "I don't know." I sneaked a look and got nailed. Andreessen had his eye on our window. Right away, up went his dumb old hand for a wave. I waved back like a dolt. "Reuben! Now he'll come over here for sure." "Sorry, Swede." I was wretched, on my haunches. "Here, you look. Tell me if he's coming." But he wasn't. That must have been some plate of French fries, and the longer he ate, the more bugged Swede got. Smug fathead! He ought to just come over here and talk to us. Does he think we're getting all scared with him just sitting there eating? Who told him we were here anyway? Maybe we better wake up Dad. "Sure, Dad'll go talk things over with Mr. Andreessen. Mr. Federale," she said, nothing, expressing contempt like a timely morsel of Spanish. Wait a second. He's done. Done what? With his French fries. Is he coming? Nope, going. For Andreessen had balled up his paper plate and crept the Mercury forward to a public trash can. He made his deposit, caught me watching again, saluted this time, and tooled away. "Chicken," Swede said. "Shyster. Putrid Fed. Gets our attention, then runs off. You know what he is? He's desperate, following us because he can't think of anything else to do." I admired Swede's certainty, but didn't share it. For one thing, I had a good look at Andreessen when he was looking back. If forced, I might have described that look as a sharp or canny or borderline humorous. Probably not desperate, though. Desperate guys don't salute. "So where do you think he went, Swede?" Probably off to let us stew. That shyster. Probably to the public toilet. Stinker. We'll wake up Dad, Sweet decided, and get out of town. When Anderson gets back, we'll be gone. Do you think we should? Won't we get in trouble? Did we do anything wrong? No, but it felt like we had, or were about to. She snared my arm. Should we tell Dad about him, do you think? I nodded, ready to run to do so. How often do we get to deliver Dad actual news? But she shook her head. He might want to wait around and talk to Anderson. So, we're innocent, like you said. I know, but Anderson might do something unfair. He might make us go back home. I didn't think he could do that, even if he did work for the federal government. Sweet said feds often broke their own rules. A sentiment gleaned from Mr. DeCullough, and one she maintains to this day. You think old Anderson can tell Dad what to do? I said. Let her answer an uncomfortable question for once. I'm afraid of it, she admitted. In the end, though, all our stratagems came to naught because Dad woke with a record headache to suggest, in a distressed whisper, that we stay parked till morning. Instantly, I recollected August's apprehensions about Dad's health, but he swallowed the 2 aspirin and promised to be better by supper, provided it was chicken and dumplings. He's really sick, Sweet told me outside his shut bedroom, but I clung to Dad's promise. What's in dumplings? Baking powder, flour, milk. But she wore a pout at this turn of events, and I couldn't blame her. She'd been picturing us slipping out while Anderson sat on the toilet. We made the dumplings with the Swanson chicken, 1 whole chicken in a can, and Dad, as sworn, emerged to eat, declaring full recovery. He didn't look much better, but then it was hard to see him. Rather than use the Airstream's lamps, Dad claimed to prefer the ambient dimness thrown off by the streetlights of Linton. It was more romantic, he said. Obviously cover for his light-pained eyes, but we went right along. Are you familiar with canned chicken? Romantic lighting doesn't hurt. Someone banged on the door. Yes, Dad called. It was so dark I couldn't see his expression. Mr. Land, it's Martin Anderson. Dad was silent in a moment. Ever since, I've thought he believed, just for a second, that it was Davy out there, come to reconcile. He stood, struck a match, lit a mantle in the kitchen. Come in. Anderson was hatless and smiling in a fresh haircut and tan, knee-length topcoat. In the gaslight, he glowed like pale skin. He looked younger than when we last saw him, which alongside Dad seemed monstrously unfair. He said, Lovely weather. I enjoy the Dakotas. Don't get out here as often as I'd like. Dad stood with his hands on the back of the kitchen chair, his face all pouched with headache. I couldn't help but remember the pronouncement he'd made to Anderson that previous time. You and I will not speak again. What power had flowed from him in that sentence? How prophetic and incontestable he had sounded. Dad seemed to be thinking similarly, for he gave me a wry, so much for pronouncements look and said, Do you have news for us, Mr. Anderson? Why, no, I don't. Then your purpose here is abstruse, Dad said politely. I'm glad to explain. You departed suddenly in the middle of January. Your rent is paid through April, though you no longer draw a salary and you have no savings. Half of roofing thinks your mind soured. They think you're out here eating locusts. Dad chuckled. How about the other half? They believe you heard from your boy and are gone to meet him. Which theory appeals to you? I'm trying to think what else could bring you here, now. He meant to the Great Plains in midwinter. It actually wasn't a bad question. We're looking for him, Dad said. Anderson appeared to be waiting for explication, finally prompting, Did he contact you? No. Did he contact August and Bertie? Notice he didn't even say Schultz. Anderson's familiarity with our whereabouts, finances, and friends was a type of worry I'd never encountered before. Yes, he did, Dad said. August told me differently, Anderson said. Very loyal, though it does leave him open to accessory charges. What directions did your boy leave him? None. Anderson looked at Dad as though he were a slow child. Mr. Land, it's my responsibility to find your son. At the moment, it's my only responsibility. I believe we are close to him right now. If you know more than you're saying, you could save his life by coming out with it. I've been honest with you, Mr. Anderson. You could also save August and Bertie some grief down the line. It's a shame they lied to me. Dad said, You yourself have lied twice since stepping in here. That set Anderson back a step, and he didn't contest it either. I was still wondering which 2 statements were false when he nodded, set his hand on the door, and said, Mr. Land, You and I don't have to be enemies. Mr. Anderson, Dad replied. It appears that we do. So departed our putrid fed in a gust of Chinook from the door, and a few moments later, in popped Swede in her overcoat. We hadn't even noticed she was gone. I had to run to the gas station, she said breathlessly. There was a Phillips 66 we were using. Hanging her coat neatly in the closet, she set about the kitchen in a brisk way, brewing coffee for Dad, laying things shipshape, and finally slipping into the saddle, where she dashed off the following. The blizzard shipped in from the west like a grin on a darkened, malevolent face, and the posse that sought Mr. Sundown was caught in an awfully dangerous place. For their horses were sore, and their chances were poor of locating warmth or repose. When the sweet sudden sight of miraculous light shone dim in the dark and the snows, my lads, a light through the dark and the snows. And the lady who answered their knock at the door had answered another an hour before. The above was possibly 4 minutes' work for Swede, who, remember, was no typist. So fully did she own these lines, so resonant were her strokes upon the keys, that Dad said, "My goodness, Swede, don't you know Moby Dick has already been written?" But no response. I guess she was just too elevated to hear him. She bid them to stay in her courteous way, and insisted they sit by the fire, and she poured them all brandy and sang them a song, and they slept as though lulled by a choir. The sheriff next morning was first to awake, and he called all his men to the chase, for a dream had suggested their quarry sought rest in the hay in the barn on the place, lads. He'd slept in the barn on the place. But when they crept into the building to spy, gone horses, gone lady, gone outlaw, goodbye. Dad's headache was gone in the morning. In fact, he suggested pancakes after Swede routed us from bed. The routing itself should have alerted me to something. Swede was rarely awake before Dad, whose early minutes with King James were not negotiable. "Can't we get going?" Swede begged. It was close to wheedling, a bad sound at the time of day. "Let's just have cornflakes." Dad felt none of her urgency. No mistake, Anderson had tossed a wet washcloth on the trip. In fact, Dad was inclined to laze around Linton for a while. After all, he'd been honest with the Fed. We weren't on Davy's schedule or anyone else's. Maybe the thing to do was snuggle down and wait on the Lord. "Anyhow, Anderson hates North Dakota," Dad said. "I knew it right off. Won't he get disgusted if we just plop down for a month?" "But Davy," Swede began. "Davy's in the palm of God's hand, like all of us are. A few days' wait may be the best thing for everybody." Normally, this would have been how the discussion ended, for Dad said, "Now, what about those pancakes?" "I don't feel very good," Swede said. Dad leaned at her. "Why, you are pale. It's early yet. Why don't you go back to bed?" Swede climbed back in her bunk. Dad turned the gas low so the trailer was dim and warm and restful. I dozed myself, hearing only the occasional turn of a page as Dad read. Then Swede said quietly, "Dad?" There was a pause which brought me alert. "I have been praying, and I believe it is the will of God that we get going." Dad sat back and stretched, rose up without reply, and closed his Bible. "Well, Reuben," he said, "get out the cornflakes. At the very least, it's the will of Swede. Let's go." It was on this day we began to imagine ourselves truly far from home. By sunup, we'd bumped into the great Missouri River and struck north along its banks. Dad had informed us that when we crossed the Missouri at Mandan, we would leave Central Time and enter Mountain Time, a concept he ought to have cleared up, as it put all sorts of snow-capped expectations in our heads. Meantime, it was a good drive yet to Mandan in the trailer, which was freezing. What's over as quick as a January thaw? Swede retreated to the back of the trailer to stare at the highway, falling eastward behind us. "Come on if you're cold," she said. That end was Dad's bedroom. She was sitting on his bed, Indian style, under a hump of quilts. "We did it, huh?" I slipped away from Anderson, is what I meant, leaving town in the dark that way. "Yep." I poked her under the blankets. "Think how he felt this morning, coming down to the park and us gone. Think how he feels right now." "Pretty mad, you think?" Swede smiled, but there wasn't any winning in it, which was irritating, it seemed to me. We hadn't won many rounds lately, and here was Swede refusing to enjoy a clear victory. In fact, she had hollow half-moons under her eyes, like some bad old woman. She watched the empty road distrustfully. "Maybe he doesn't know it yet," I ran on. "Probably he's down at the cafe, eating hard-boiled eggs. He's having another cup of coffee, reading the newspaper." "Hating that he's in North Dakota," Swede added, drawn in. I figured, but by my skillful use of detail. Yes, hating it like everything. Damn North Dakotians all over the place. And in about 10 minutes, he'll finish up and drive down to the city park, and we're gone. What do you think he'll do? But Swede's enthusiasm was momentary, for she replied, Well, who knows? I guess he won't do what he won't do is trot back to Minneapolis all beat and sorry. And you know what? He found us without much trouble. I suppose he can find us again. And that was all that was said for some time, because it was cold, boy, and we seemed to gain little heat from each other, held in our own thoughts as we were, two blankety lumps watching the barren highway zip to nothing. It was a cheerless, frost-flattened world, this west edge of Central Time. The ditches that had flowed dark with runoff had refrozen in the wind. You never like it to happen, for something as hopeful and sudden as a January thaw to come to an end, but end it does, and then you want to have some quilts around. Remember the fuel economy of the 1955 Plymouth wagon? Thirsty power under the best conditions. When pulling great weight, our car became a carping slave demanding refreshment. Yes, gas was cheap, as I am constantly reminded, and yes, the Plymouth had an ample tank. Still, service stations were not the frequent, well-lit, prosperous concerns they are today, and Dad had bought and filled 2 red 5-gallon cans that might extend our range another 100 miles, generally enough to reach a gas pump, even on the Great Plains. These we cached with a case of 40 weight in a closet midships of the Airstream. Shortly after leaving roofing, we'd stop for a fill, my job being to get out the cans and have the attendant attend to them once he'd satisfied the wagon. It's funny, I'd recognize that attendant were he to appear today, for he had one ear grown all thick and proportionless beside his head, a condition described as cauliflower ear, though this looked more like a good strong burdock leaf. He looked confused when Dad handed him a $10 bill, as though thrown by the need to make change, and he admired the trailer aloud several times, admired it as though we were wealthy travelers and people beyond his reach. In return, I was fascinated by the looks of his ear, the way it splayed off his skull like a bark fungus, and I recall how little meaning I gave it later when Dad told me such flagrancies were the common bane of boxers in the bare-knuckle days, who routinely took ferocious hits. How comforting, those extra cans. In no way was I expecting to run out of gas. To me, it only meant we were serious in this business. We would travel as far as necessary, staying gone through seasons, years if we had to, until we got what we come for, whatever exactly that was. Thanks to Swede, I was no longer sure, but sometime in the middle of the morning, just as I was bequeathing her all my stuff should freeze to death, Dad pulled into a Sinclair station in the midst of nowhere, and Swede and I hopped numbly down. Nobody here, Dad said. It was a little white gas station with the green stripe painted all around. Emptiest spot you ever saw. All morning the wind had risen, and the Sinclair sign with its green brontosaurus rocked and groaned on high. I'd like to gas up, he mused, but I guess we can get to Mandan. We can easily get that far. Besides, we have the reserves. But we didn't gas up in Mandan. We crossed the Missouri, entering mountain time. The mountains must be a few miles away still, Swede remarked, but the city of Mandan held no gas for us. First service station we came to, Dad slowed way down, then changed his mind and slid by. Why didn't we stop? I asked. 19.9 a gallon, Dad replied, his eyes on the rear view. I believe we can do better. An explanation I bought. Why wouldn't I? Though Swede whispered there'd been a state car parked at that very station, a trooper in sunglasses inside it, watching traffic. We cruised along into Mandan, a good-sized town on the Missouri River named for the Indian tribe Lewis and Clark wintered with. Those Mandans knew something about games, Swede told me. That's what they did with Lewis and Clark. Feasted and gave presents and played games till the ice broke up. Dad passed another gas station. There was one, I told him. I thought he hadn't seen it. Yes, there it was, he said. Can we get something to eat when we stop? I inquired. He didn't answer, and moreover didn't slow when we approached yet another station, by now well into town. Seeing he was about to miss this one too, I opened my mouth to advise him, only to have Swede grip my coat sleeve. I yanked away. She looked scared and savage. By looking past her as we went by the station, I saw a trooper in his parka and ranger hat, leaning against his car in the wind. I'll admit the sight thrilled me. Not that I believed the trooper was looking for us, which seemed a stretch, in the dark as we were about Davy, but Swede plainly believed he was, and Dad wasn't stopping. Swede signed me to keep my mouth shut. We were all so quiet, in fact, that Mandan in my memory is a silent movie. People on the sidewalk shrugging in the hard wind and hard, white, useless sun, disappointingly few men in cowboy hats and those dressed wrongly in flapping bankers' topcoats. A cafe with breakfast menus posted in the window and a couple of dogs waiting at the door. An actual, living, long-haired Indian stepping from a barber shop, and everything in person getting knocked around by the bossy wind except the troopers, who on that day were sitting in their state cars at every gas station in Mandan, North Dakota, looking dispassionately out their windows. And so still were these men, and so unmoved in their faces, and so flat out many were they, dispersed like hunters across a field, that I knew they were indeed looking for us, and for Davy, through us. At once I took a fierce chill. A sob rippled up from my throat, and I couldn't do a thing about it. It sure is one thing to say you're at war with the whole world and stick your chest out believing it, but when the world shows up with its crushing numbers and its predatory knowledge, it is another thing completely. I shut my eyes and rocked.